and Hackey, a former Compton School District police officer.
This is Hackey as a police officer in Plumper, Dunkin' Donut days.
Worked for 2 years as an undercover agent
to investigate Marion Knight and death row records for racketeering violations.
Los Angeles police officer found dozens and dozens of his fellow police officers at all levels of death row records. When he went to his superiors to ask what were they doing there, they said you can consider them covert agents.
John Potash is an author who wrote the FBI's War on Tupac, which looks into the US intelligence's ties being into death row records and Tupac Shakur. He has made claims in which he believes his research has led him into thinking that death row records had become an intelligence front company being through infiltration, unbeknownst to Suge Knight, which was ultimately used in assisting in the death of Tupac Shakur due to his activism connections and influence.
Death row records was a US intelligence front company, and one of their goals was to aid in the murder of Tupac Shakur.
Death row records had been infiltrated by many different intelligence agencies, such as the ATF, the FBI, and the LAPD, who used undercover assets to collect information on the label.
Worked for 2 years as an undercover agent for the FBI and ATF, helping the feds.
In this video, we're going to take a look into the scope of infiltration, which was directed into death row records, and just how covertly overrun it had become.
Took a lot of help from Suge Knight and Harry O and a number of people, and we got it all together.
And that's on tape, and the FBI confiscated that from me.
Suge Knight's origins in monetary startup for the label can be tied into the Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s. The Iran-Contra affair was a political scandal being in the United States during the 1980s, which resulted in many inner-city kingpins to become rich being through intelligence connections, which played a part in the funding of death row records. President Ronald Reagan joined a war in the country of Nicaragua to help a rebel group known as the Contras, being in fighting against an overthrow of a pro-communist group called the Sandinistas. The Boland Amendment was passed by US Congress in 1984, which by law prevented Ronald Reagan's administration with interfering in Nicaraguan affairs. The US assistance then continued covertly after this, which spawned the Iran-Contra affair. Danilo Blandón was a Nicaraguan drug trafficker who became a DEA and CIA asset. Blandón, while being in line with his intelligence connections, was trafficking drugs into California, with the money going back to Nicaragua to fund the covert operation. Blandón was responsible for supplying California kingpin Freeway Rick Ross being with kilos of cocaine, which would then be sold to the Bloods and Crips of Los Angeles. Freeway Rick Ross was behind creating the connection between Suge Knight and Death Row Records financier being Michael Harry O. Harris. Harry O was a drug trafficker who worked with Freeway Rick Ross and had ties to the Colombian cartels through Mario Villabona, who had connections in Washington, D.C. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, through the Department of Justice, chose to lock up two intelligence assets together being in the same cell, being of Lompoc Federal Correctional Institute in California, where Freeway Rick Ross and Harry O were locked up together. Behind bars, the idea of death row records was first cultivated, being by two former drug traffickers, who were pawns of US intelligence through the Iran-Contra scandal. Harry O, while serving a 32-year prison sentence, was attempting with producing his wife Lydia's album, wanting to become reacquainted with the entertainment industry. Harry O then began this for a New York-born, California-based lawyer called David Kenner. Kenner was part of a fraternity of high-profile attorneys, with Kenner becoming the first lawyer to serve as defense counsel, being on the first ever federal drug kingpin case of the Iran-Contra era, made under Operation Polar Cap, which Kenner won for his client. Harry O hired David Kenner for his cases, and Freeway Rick Ross was in the attorney room when Harry O began to discuss an entertainment venture being with David Kenner, long before it became Death Row Records. Harry O and David Kenner came up with Godfather Entertainment, which was Harry O's newly founded entertainment company, which he now wanted talent for. Freeway Rick Ross recommended that he get Dr. Dre to produce for his wife, leading to Suge Knight's introduction. Dr. Dre, being an established producer and artist at the time, after leaving multi-platinum rap group NWA through the help of Suge Knight, was now partners with Suge, looking to start something new. Ron Brown, being a former NFL player for the Rams, who Suge Knight had also played for, then got word from Harry O to Suge Knight to set up a meeting in prison. Suge Knight then became aware of David Kenner, who was Harry O's lawyer, with meetings then being set up in prison. Three-Way Rick Ross, along with Harry O and David Kenner, were in the attorney room together when the first meeting between Suge Knight and Harry O had taken place, where due to the situation in prison, the name of Death Row Records was officially created, with it becoming a parent company of Godfather Entertainment. Harry O and Suge Knight agreed to a $1.5 million investment of startup money, with this money coming from Crip gang affiliated Compton drug trafficker Pat Johnson. Pat Johnson was also locked up on a federal drug case and had David Kenner as his attorney, with the drug money being made from the Iran-Contra affair then being transported from the streets to David Kenner, with it then being laundered through Death Row Records. Harry O had brokered the deal with Pat Johnson's money, with the promise of a return being from Suge Knight. However, Suge Knight and David Kenner had double-crossed Harry O. In February of 1992, the Death Row Records brand launch party was held on Grammy night at the high-profile restaurant called Chasen's in Beverly Hills. The event was held under Godfather Entertainment, with the $1.2 million laundered drug money from Pat Johnson being used through Harry O to launch the brand. Harry O soon received the incorporation paperwork to find out that David Kenner had set up a separate Death Row Records, being apart from Godfather Entertainment, after they had successfully launched a brand using the money. Suge Knight and David Kenner now had their own Death Row Records company being separate from Harry O, with David Kenner becoming the principal business attorney and criminal defense attorney for the label. Death Row Records got a 50-50 distribution deal with Interscope Records shortly after. Interscope Records was founded in 1990 by Jimmy Iovine and Ted Fields as a $20 million joint venture with Warner Music Group. Warner Music Group are one of the big four labels who own and control 85% of the music industry. Warner Music Group was formed in 1991 from Time Warner. Time Warner had formed being from a merger of Time Inc. and Warner Communications in 1989. Time Inc.'s senior executive was once General Charles Douglas Jackson, who was a mediator for information between the CIA and the Pentagon. He was a US government propagandist who was an expert in psychological warfare. In the 1990s, Warner Music Group had purchased many record labels, including a joint venture with Interscope, to acquire a 22% share of the domestic music market in America. Warner Music Group were threatening to pull their funding from Interscope unless they brought something new to the market, with them then introducing Death Row Records. Interscope, through the deal with Death Row Records, then became involved in the money laundering operation, being from the startup money with Harry O, with Harry O then writing a letter to Jimmy Iovine regarding a lawsuit. Harry O's wife, Lydia Harris, said that she would go public to the news about the true story of the money situation, so Interscope had paid a settlement to Harry O to squash the publicity. Kenner had met with Harry O in prison to discuss the Interscope lawsuit, and the following day, Harry O was rushed into medical with symptoms of poisoning.
I asked Mike, I said, well, Kenner give you anything?
David is as smooth as you want to be and as vicious as you want to be.
We can now see the origins of infiltration of Death Row Records, with funding resulting from the Iran-Contra affair being tied into US intelligence, with this then crossing over into the Department of Justice through the Federal Bureau of Prisons, placing two kingpins involved in the affair in the same cell, where the planning of the venture then started, with it then being orchestrated and launched through the attorney's office with help of David Kenner. Death Row Records then shortly after became infiltrated by police departments.
Los Angeles police officer found dozens and dozens of his fellow police officers at all levels of Death Row Records. When he went to his superiors to ask what were they doing there, they said you can consider them covert agents.
Informants told him officers Mack and Perez were closely tied to Death Row.
They seemed to be close confidants in the inner circle of Death Row Records.
Suge Knight, after he'd gotten distribution from Interscope, generated over $150 million, being from 1992 to 94 off of the success of Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, who were signed to death row. Being from Compton, he had gotten himself involved in the gang life, although he was never a gangbanger and actually went to college. But during his time in the industry, he paid Compton mob Pyru Bloods to be his homeboys and hang around with him to supply his personal security. Reggie Wright Sr. was the head of Compton's gang division, being of the police department, and he had gotten intel of an upcoming plot, being of the Bloods, to kidnap Suge Knight and hold him hostage for ransom. Reggie Wright Sr. alerted Suge Knight of the plot, then Reggie Wright Jr., being his son and a former Compton cop, was loaned $300,000 to start Right Ways Protective Services, which began with supplying police protection for the label. Kevin Hackey was an officer under the Compton Unified School District's police force, who became the police partner of Reggie Wright Jr. after he had been partners with a cop called Smokey Burrell. In the book Labyrinth by Randall Sullivan, Kevin Hackey claimed that Reggie Wright Jr. and his partner Smokey Burrell were allegedly, according to him, notorious for ripping off drug dealers, and Hackey believed that was how Reggie and Suge had met. Kevin Hackey claimed the 1993 murder of 2 Compton police officers, with one being Smokey Burrell, Reggie Wright Jr.'s former partner, had been due to corrupt practices, and the person who killed Smokey may have been robbed by the officers beforehand. Kevin Hackey began working under Right Way Security in 1994 and supplied the artists with protection. Reggie Wright Jr. had upward of 25 police officers being under the security service from multiple police departments across Los Angeles. LAPD detective Russell Paul filed police reports which had claimed that corrupt cops from the LAPD Rampart Division had been working security for $75 per hour. This theory has been pushed by Russell Paul, coming from the statements of bodyguards and other cops who he had interviewed, although no official paperwork has ever proved it. The police chief himself, Bernard Parks, did claim that the cops had worked for Death Row Records when he was questioned about it by documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield.
We know that David Mack and Rafael Perez both worked security in Death Row Records.
Now, the Rampart scandal was actually one of the worst police corruption cases in US history, with the cops being notorious for stealing drugs from evidence lockers, along with planting evidence to make cases. Kevin Gaines was a Rampart cop who was found to have been dating Suge Knight's ex-wife Sharifa Knight, who was in charge of Nightlife Entertainment, which was the management company of Death Row artists. Sharifa Knight had been managing Snoop Dogg and revealed during a phone call with Reggie Wright Jr. that Snoop Dogg was paying Kevin Gaines in cash to supply security. Snoop Dogg was acquitted of murder, being in 1996, being defended by David Kenner, and the acquittal came after key evidence had went missing from the LAPD Pacific Division evidence locker, which, surprise surprise, Kevin Gaines had dominion over. The main cops who were linked to the Rampart scandal were Kevin Gaines, Rafael Perez, and David Mack. FBI documents show that Kevin Gaines was in Las Vegas being on a special assignment for the LAPD on the night that Tupac was shot in Las Vegas. Southside Compton Crip gang member Keefe D, who was tied into the Tupac murder through Orlando Anderson, claimed in an interview with documentary filmmaker RJ Bond how the cops had allegedly also been hitmen for hire, getting their hands dirty, taking care of all the dirty work. The book Labyrinth by Randall Sullivan, which interviewed LA detective Russell Paul, takes a look into the May 96 murder of Bruce Richardson in relation to these accusations. Bruce Richardson was a major South Central LA drug dealer who was respected by both the Bloods and Crips, who had done business with Suge Knight, being through an artist who featured on work with the label. Suge Knight never paid Bruce for the work, and Bruce confronted Suge Knight in a nightclub where he attacked Suge Knight until he was pulled off by the enforcers. Bruce Richardson was found dead, being in his home 2 weeks later, with no signs of forcible entry, and the book Labyrinth claimed that the door may have been opened to people being in LAPD uniforms. Rafael Perez and David Mack were listed as defendants along with Suge Knight and Reggie Wright Jr. in the 1997 death of Biggie Smalls, based on Russell Paul's findings.
The exact same tactics were used to kill Biggie Smalls. US intelligence would call collateral damage.
John Potash revealed how when Russell Paul had asked his fellow police officers as to why there were so many cops working for Death Row, he was was told to consider them as covert agents. So this indicates that through the cops' connection, the police had begun with infiltrating Death Row Records. Suge Knight, in his 2020 prison interview with author Michael Douglas Carlin, had named the cops as allegedly being involved in the murder of Tupac Shakur, claiming that they were trying to kill him too for the gain of Death Row Records.
They were trying to kill me too because they want the ownership of my company.
A former Compton School District police officer worked for 2 years as an undercover agent for the FBI and ATF, helping the feds.
Kevin Hackey was approached by the FBI and the ATF to go undercover in 1994 and pose as a bodyguard to infiltrate Death Row Records. He was tasked with investigating racketeering violations, money laundering, and a string of homicides connected to Suge Knight. Kevin Hackey had claimed that he had discovered that David Kenner was the brains behind the label and claimed it was common knowledge at Death Row Records that the attorney provided connections to organized crime families in New York. Kevin Hackey had identified LAPD officer Kevin Gaines as showing up regularly at private parties held by Suge Knight, along with identifying David Mack and Rafael Perez as being around the label. Hackey provided numerous places and dates where he had seen David Mack and or Rafael Perez being with Suge Knight, beginning with the Black Image Awards show at the Beverly Hills Hotel in '95. Hackey claimed the FBI had wiretaps on Suge Knight's personal communication, along with the officers of Death Row Records, and were also actively following the label, having them under surveillance. Kevin Hackey began with bodyguarding Tupac after David Kenner had him released from prison and signed to Death Row Records in October of '95. Author John Potash believes that the FBI had been using COINTELPRO against Tupac, which had been being used prior against his mother as part of her ties to the Black Panthers. Some of the tactics by the FBI had included fabricating anonymous letters to drive the East Coast Black Panthers against the West Coast to divide the group, as in a strategy of divide and conquer. While Tupac was in prison, he claimed strangers were telling him, and he was getting letters, how Biggie had set him up, fueling the East Coast-West Coast War, which took place after he was released. In the 1996 Tupac song Against All Odds, which was released after he died, he calls Haitian Jack a snitch, as it's believed he was working as an informant for the FBI and was behind setting up Tupac in a 1993 misconduct case which led to Tupac's incarceration. Kevin Hackey was assigned to monitor Tupac's activity by the FBI and report back to them. Further information was revealed about Hackey's undercover operation by Tupac's former artist Napoleon. Napoleon, who was part of Tupac's group The Outlaws, revealed on his podcast in 2021 how Kevin Hackey had introduced arms trafficking into Tupac's inner circle in what resembled a gun walking operation. Napoleon revealed how Kevin Hackey was selling guns to Tupac's inner circle along with bulletproof vests, with Napoleon believing that it was part of an operation to keep track of them.
There was a guy named Hackey. He was an undercover ATF. He was selling us guns so we could keep track of them.
Yeah.
And also he had a connection to bulletproof vests.
With Kevin Hackey being undercover for the ATF, it resembles what are called gun walking operations, which are carried out by the ATF, with a notable case being Operation Fast and Furious. This operation was carried out by the ATF, which was supplying Mexican cartels with automatic weapons, being in a sting operation against drug lord El Chapo, with the intention of tracking the guns to make arrests. The guns had later turned up as being trafficked to Chicago, being linked to gang-related murders. Randall Sullivan's Labyrinth book revealed how Hackey, while he was undercover, had heard Suge Knight discussing an arms trafficking operation. Hackey had revealed to Fox News how the FBI would then track the guns of Tupac's inner circle, and he had revealed how on the 4th of July 1996, while Tupac was performing at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, an off-duty Santa Monica cop who was working security had searched Tupac's outlaw artist Hussein Fatal and had found a .40 caliber Glock. Hackey had revealed on Fox News that the gun was then requested by the FBI to be run through the federal database by the ATF, where it came back as clean. Kevin Hackey revealed how the FBI had then told him to collect the weapon and give it back to Death Row security. Hackey in the same interview claimed that he believes it was the same weapon used in the shooting of Tupac.
A month later in Las Vegas, Investigators say it was a .40 Glock handgun that killed Tupac Shakur. Hackey believes the murder weapon was the same gun.
I believe it is.
Hackey had been requested by Reggie Wright Jr. to be in Las Vegas on the night that Tupac was shot. However, he was assigned elsewhere, and Hackey had told Tupac not to go, as he revealed that the wiretap conversations had become extremely suspicious on the days leading up to the incident. Hackey was in the possession of a security radio of one of the bodyguards being on the night which it occurred, and as he was assigned elsewhere, it broke down the communication between the security detail, which made them more vulnerable on the night. Hackey revealed how he had the FBI documents to prove that the FBI were tailing Suge Knight and Tupac on the night of the shooting and had them under surveillance when it took place.
Somebody who was working for the FBI, Kevin Hackey, said he had the documents to prove that the FBI had Tupac under surveillance when he was killed.
Death Row Records had also been infiltrated by Hollywood through connections to publicists into the bizarre world of Hollywood symbolism. Suge Knight hated Hollywood people, which he expressed throughout several interviews, but to remain getting publicity from the most popular platforms in Hollywood, he delegated Death Row's cooperation with Hollywood being through publicists. One of their first publicists was a man called Norman Winter, who was also the publicist to Michael Jackson, Elton John, Bob Dylan, and a host of other stars. The second publicist was George Price, who Suge Knight called Papa Hollywood, who would set up coverage with popular Hollywood platforms, which the talent would then be subjected to. In this clip, you can see that the creative control had been handed over to Papa G's Hollywood Connections, being for the creation of Tupac's album cover, as the Hollywood Connections covered photo shoots and publicity. This then leads into the bizarre world of Hollywood symbolism, which examples can be seen throughout Death Row Records, indicating that the Hollywood Connection had infiltrated the publicity aspect. This comes down to occult symbolism being used throughout the label, which was directly tied into the creative control of the Hollywood Connection. Actor Stephen Baldwin, who is a big fan of hip-hop and has been seen hanging out with Tupac, had been questioned about this on Sway's radio show, where he admitted that for whatever reason, Hollywood forces artists to include occult symbolism in their music videos.
Very famous musicians and their music videos and images you clearly see in them. Call it Illuminati, call it whatever you want.
Former CIA officer Kevin Shipp claimed in a documentary Out of Shadows that this was a psychological operation which was based off the teachings of Michael Aquino, who wrote a manual on how occult symbolism could be used for mind control. Others believe it is used to show who is part of the quote-unquote club, with this idea coming from movies such as Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick, which showed prominent members of society secretly attending ritualistic mansion parties, being in masks and robes. Cat Williams spoke on these mansion parties and how they would occur in Hollywood, where mischievous and grotesque activities would take place.
They be having these big ass mansion parties, and the mansion party, the whole mansion is a party, and then it's a separate party in the little room. You be looking at all the goddamn rooms, and you round and look in the wrong room.
Keefe D, during an interview, claimed that Tupac and Suge Knight had attended one of these parties after being invited by a Hollywood circle. Reggie Wright Jr. had also claimed during an interview that there were unreleased photos and footage of Suge Knight's private parties. As for the Hollywood symbolism, it uses occult symbols such as signs and sigils throughout the artwork for those who are aware of it. On Snoop Dogg's second album, which was released under Death Row, called The Dogfather, we can see that the Baphomet symbolism is used, which replicates the image, replacing Snoop Dogg as the demon. As we saw earlier, Papa Hollywood would run the album covers past the artists once they had been complete by his Hollywood connections, which the artists then went along with. Another occult sign are the sigils and astronomical signs of planets, which get tied into planetary magic, with Saturn being used heavily throughout the music industry due to its occult connotation. Saturn's magic square in planetary occult magic gives back the number of 666, so you probably get the idea of why the planet is used. This is the astronomical sign of Saturn, which American hard rock band Blue Oyster Cult had used while creating their logo. Artist Bill Gowlick designed a logo for them, separating the sign of Saturn into 5 parts, being hook, bars, and a dot. On their album cover for Agents of Fortune, Saturn can be seen placed atop a pyramid behind a man's back, while the man is pointing at the symbol. It also shows the man holding out a deck of cards, symbolizing the magical aspect involved. Jimi Hendrix, after his death, had his image used to promote this same symbol in the compilation album South Saturn Delta. This same symbol was used in the Death Row Records early logo when it was being developed. So it's not as if Suge Knight had any idea of this, but through the Hollywood infiltration of the publicist's creative department, it took place within Death Row Records. Another symbolic Hollywood photo shoot which was set up by Papa Hollywood, or Papa G, was the infamous bathtub photo shoot with Tupac. This has become known as bathtub symbolism, and it is tied into water rituals of the occult, which are expressions of demonic ideals and forces such as Leviathan, which is a water spirit used to bind souls to the demonic realm. Madonna, Nicki Minaj, Drake, Britney Spears and Rihanna, along with a whole host of other stars, have gone through this process of symbolism. Here is a photo from a masked ball of one of the parties taking place where the symbolism is also used. Tupac was subjected to this symbolism through Papa G's Hollywood connections, which was used for publicity for his upcoming album All Eyes on Me. Tupac had his final album cover designed himself through his own creative control by a Compton artist called Risky, which Tupac called Illuminati, which showed him crucified on the cross, claiming he was killing off the Illuminati influence. Tupac was killed before the album was released.
I believe Tupac was asked to be a part of it. Okay. And he was going to be a part of it. Then he turned it down. Then he did a Don Chappelle photo.
With the gold in the tub.
Right.
It's all symbolism if you got in rituals, if you guys. So he was going through the process.
Right.
Gotcha.
Another Hollywood infiltration can be seen with what has been called Star Whackers. Actor Randy Quaid claimed that these were a group of Hollywood attorneys, estate planners, and others who go to the extent of bringing down celebrities to gain riches off of them during their downfall.
I've been racketeered on. My finances have been decimated by a group of people. They've manipulated the system, the court system, to have us falsely arrested, to co-opt my corporations.
After Tupac was killed, Suge Knight was sentenced to 9 years in prison due to a probation violation for an incident which took place on the night of the murder. Suge Knight during this time turned over control of his accounts and investments to his financial advisors, being David Chesnoff and Steve Steiner, who were serving on his legal team with David Kenner. Over $13 million were churned out in legal fees going to the law offices of Kenner, shared between the parties. In Suge Knight's 2020 prison interview, he claimed that distributor Jimmy Iovine, along with David Kenner, were getting paid $100K per month after the murder had taken place, while Suge Knight was dealing with incarceration.
They was giving David $100,000 a month, and David said he was giving Jimmy a kickback from $100,000 a month.
He also claimed that an accounting firm who Jimmy Iovine had set him up with had allegedly stole upward of $40 million after the murder had taken place.
I never should have went to prison the first time I went to prison. I should have got a violation. I was in jail. I had caught the accounting firm who Jimmy introduced us to. They stole $30-40 million.
Tupac had fired both David Kenner and Reggie Wright Jr. prior to going to Las Vegas, with Tupac firing David Kenner 2 weeks before the trip had taken place, with it being Kenner who had set up a fundraising event for a Las Vegas attorney, which Tupac had to travel to, so he didn't go back to jail. Tupac and Suge Knight were travelling to this event when the shooting took place. Suge Knight personally lost upward of $60 million from 1996 to 1997 after the shooting had taken place. Jimmy Iovine sold the acquisition of business acquirements from Death Row Records after Tupac's death and Suge Knight's downfall, being for $500 million, with the original funding from Death Row to Interscope coming from the laundered drug money of the Iran-Contra affair through Harry O and Pat Johnson. The 2016 TV series Case Closed claims the $500 million company was then signed over to Reggie Wright Jr., being in 1997 by Suge Knight, with Reggie Wright Jr. running the company with advice from David Kenner.
After Tupac is killed and after Suge goes to jail, you have complete confusion until Suge signs over the record label to Reggie Wright Jr., and then all the chaos stops.
In this video, we took a look into the many layers of infiltration which took place within Death Row Records. The infiltration took place with US intelligence, police departments, Hollywood, and many other factors. Both Tupac and the preceding death of Biggie Smalls still remains unsolved, and it's likely due to the amount of infiltration which had taken place. John Potash believes Biggie Smalls' death was collateral damage to cover up Tupac's death to make it seem like an East Coast West Coast war, which was a narrative created by the media. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, smash the thumbs up button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and press that bell button so you can get all the future notifications for when I upload. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.